I want to ask you to join me as we consider a few passages of Scripture by way of an introduction this morning. And I want you, as we read these three Scriptures together, want you to listen to see if you can find something they share in common. The first one is Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6, we'll read just verses 35 and 36. Again, Luke 6, beginning in verse 35. Jesus is teaching, "But love ye your enemies, and do good, and lend, hoping for nothing again, and your reward shall be great. And you shall be called the children of the highest. For he is kind unto the unthankful and to the evil. Be ye therefore merciful, as your Father also is merciful." Next, turn over to Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4. And we'll read just verse 32, the last verse of the chapter. Ephesians 4:32. Inspired penman Paul writes, "And be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, hath forgiven you." And then finally, 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1, let's read verses 15 and 16. Again, the inspired penman, this time Peter, writes, "But as he which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation, because it is written, Be ye holy, for I am holy." All right, so now you've heard the three passages. Did you notice something that all of those New Testament passages had in common? Well, we could say at least this was true. Each of them constituted an inspired exhortation in which Christians were called upon to act on a divinely imposed responsibility, namely to possess and consistently exhibit certain attributes. We might call them attitudes or virtues or qualities, however you want to phrase it, but here were certain attitudes or attributes that all Christians are to possess and then to have corresponding behavior in keeping with those attitudes. That they all had in common. But I hope you noticed something additionally. Did you also pick up on how that each of them identified those respective attributes, those virtues, qualities, attitudes, as belonging to God? In fact, I believe a careful analysis of those various contexts would bear out that those exhortations actually encouraged us to cultivate and to demonstrate those attributes because they belong to God. And because of our relationship to Him. Friends, Christians are to conscientiously, we are to diligently strive to imitate our God by manifesting those same attributes that we discover from the Scriptures belong to His nature. That's a responsibility that we as Christians have. We are to possess and demonstrate these attributes. Why? Because they belong to our God. Now, having made that general observation from those verses, please appreciate that we must quickly then recognize and acknowledge some limitations. First of all, with degree. These attributes belong to God, but guess what? God possesses them and demonstrates them perfectly, without flaw. He is always all of those things. That's not true of us. And we'll never achieve that degree of perfection as we see them in our God. But we still have the responsibility of doing our best. But it's going to be imperfect as opposed to God's having perfection in those areas. Here's another limitation, the type of attribute that we're talking about. Friends, those attributes could be categorized as communicable and incommunicable. Don't be intimidated. It's not as complex as it sounds. You see the word communicate? If you can communicate, you can share something with somebody else, right? And that's what that term means as it relates to God. There are certain attributes, virtues, qualities, true of our God that can be passed on, that can be transmitted or can be imparted and shared by us. In other words, they can be communicated. Those are called communicable attributes of God. In fact, pertaining to our passages that we just considered, all of those were communicable attributes of God. Listen to them again. Luke chapter 6, be merciful as God is merciful. See, that's something that belongs to God that we also can possess. Look at the second one, Ephesians 4:32. Be kind, be tender-hearted, forgive. Those are attributes of our God, but guess what? They can be shared by us. We also can possess and demonstrate those, again, to a lesser degree, but they are transmissible. They are communicable. And then the last one, be ye holy, for I am holy. Holiness is, again, one of these communicable divine attributes. They can be passed on. They can be transmitted to us. They can be imparted and shared and should be by Christians because we are of the divine nature, language we find in 2 Peter 1 and verse 4. Friends, when we observe these virtuous attributes in our God, guess what? God expects for us to imitate them in the lives that we live. However, thinking about our God, thinking about His divine nature, we also come to learn from the Scriptures that there are some attributes that belong exclusively to Him, to the three members of the Godhead, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. In other words, friends, those cannot be passed on to us. They are incommunicable. Here are some attributes that God does not expect us to share in. Friends, we are never going to find God commanding us to share in these. You know why? We can't. We can't. They reside solely and exclusively in the eternal, inherent qualities of our God. And so they are incommunicable. Friends, human beings have limitations, and those limitations are because of God's creating us the way He did. That is by God's design. And in keeping with that design, those limitations that God has placed upon us preclude our ever possessing these incommunicable, eternal, inherent properties of God. Now, here's why I introduced our study in this way. Friends, among those incommunicable attributes that belong to our God are omnipresence and omniscience. Hopefully you haven't forgotten, but the last time we were together, we were engaged in a series of sermons that we were focusing upon those attributes of our God. God's omnipresence. God can be everywhere at the same time. He is everywhere all the time. That's not true of me. That's not possible for me. My God also is omniscient. That means He can know everything that is to be known, wherever that might be. That's my God. Now, friends, again, we can't possess those. God never intended for us to possess those. We struggle even to comprehend how there can be a being who can be everywhere at the same time and know everything that there is to know. We struggle with even comprehending that, and we certainly cannot possess it. And so what I invited us to do in this series of studies is to acknowledge by faith that those incommunicable divine attributes, omnipresence and omniscience, even though we can't theologically understand them, we accept them by faith, they should have a very profound practical impact in our lives. And so I've invited us to look at some of the ways in which they should favorably impact our life. Knowing that God has an all-seeing eye, knowing that God is always watching us and knows us intimately, should have a practical impact in our lives. So what are some of those? Well, the first one we looked at is God's omnipresence, God's omniscience should instill and promote confidence and courage in us. But this morning I want to introduce another one, and that is God's omnipresence, God's omniscience should also comfort us. Comfort us. Do I need to make a case for the fact that we live in a hurting world? We all understand that, don't we? We readily understand that. Sin, having been introduced into the human family and bringing its many bitter fruits, it has produced a world that will regularly find multitudes of its inhabitants hurting grievously, painfully, deeply. Now that hurt is sometimes physical. That hurt sometimes is emotional, it's mental. Friends, sometimes that hurt is even spiritual. But whatever form it takes, friends, the hurt is real, isn't it? And sometimes, friends, that hurt is debilitating. Sometimes that hurt seems overwhelming in our lives. And I don't know, but if you have ever experienced that kind of hurt, maybe you can well relate to the psalmist's words in Psalm 143 and verse 4. The psalmist said, "Therefore is my spirit overwhelmed within me. My heart within me is desolate." Friends, sometimes our hurt is so painful that it leaves us in the state that is described in Psalm 6, where the psalmist says, "I am weary with my groaning. All the night make I my bed to swim. I water my couch with my tears. Mine eyes are consumed because of grief." Again, who among us would dispute we live in a hurting world? And I think without exception, those present, all of us have experienced in some form, in some way, that hurt. So that being the case, what welcome comfort, what peaceful solace should attend our hurting hearts when we know that there is a God who is always watching. That there is a God who is very much aware of our hurting, whether anyone else is or not. God knows that we're hurting. And this, friends, should especially be the response to God's all-seeing eye, His omnipresence, His omniscience, when we recognize and acknowledge who our God is. Here's what I mean by that. Friends, the relationships that our God sustains to us should be very meaningful, because they should speak to His desire, His longing to provide comfort for us when we're hurting. These relationships should help us understand that He wants to supply the needed help, the needed comfort, the needed consolation when He sees us hurting. And so I think this is significant. When God chose to reveal Himself to us through His Word, He does that by presenting Himself as sustaining numerous relationships to us. And we cannot look at all of those relationships, obviously, but as you look at those relationships, again, they should be very meaningful to us because they should help us better comprehend who our God is in a very practical way. Now, again, there are many of those relationships by which God presents Himself to us, but I invite your consideration to join me in thinking about three. Three of those identified relationships that I would submit really emphasize in a powerful way that God knows us, that God values us, and that God cares for us. Now, let me tell you why I want us to kind of give our attention to those relationships and for those reasons. Friends, if we are convinced that God knows us, that God values us, and that God cares for us, that should give us great assurance that when He does see us hurting, and He is going to see us, remember, He's omnipresent. He's omniscient. His eyes are always watching. So He is going to see when we are hurting. And so if He sees and He knows us, values us, and cares for us, what that means is He wants to comfort us. And He will comfort us. Now, again, I want to look at three. And I got to tell you, Harold, the nature of this study, I should put all three together. And I know that's not going to happen this morning. So I apologize ahead of time. We're going to have to break this up. But I don't want to rush through these relationships because I really believe each one is deserving of our understanding, how it speaks to God's knowing us, valuing us, and caring for us, so that we then, because of that relationship that God sustains to us, we then can be confident that since God is always present and always watching, He wants to comfort us when He sees us hurting. So, here's the first one, and we'll try to get this one done this morning. The first of those relationships is God is our creator. He's our creator, and He presents Himself to us in those terms. In fact, friends, this relationship is likely the first one that an individual is going to come to understand about God. That God is the one who created me. And friends, that relationship speaks to how God knows us and how well He knows us. Let me invite you quickly over to Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17, maybe you hear that chapter and you might recognize that one of the things it recounts for us is the Apostle Paul in the city of Athens. And you might remember he was left there without any co-workers for a brief period of time, and yet his spirit couldn't be stilled in him. He saw the city was given to idolatry. And so he went into the marketplace and he was observing things. And one thing that he recognized is that these are very religious people. Because there in Athens, he saw this vast multitude of idols that were erected to false gods. But then he noticed something very interesting. One of those idols had this designation, the unknown God. And so, as you would expect, Paul's preaching. The philosophers hear him and they say, what is this God he's talking about? Because he was preaching Jesus. And so they gave him an opportunity. They took him to the Areopagus, Mars Hill. I just want to quickly throw this in. Many of you, or some of you, know Glenn Hitchcock. I saw Glenn yesterday at the lectureship, and I knew he had been on a trip. I asked him where he went, and among other places, he went to Athens. And he said, I went to Mars Hill, and I said, wow. He said, I was asking folks, does anyone see Paul's footprints? Because, that would have been where Paul was standing when he delivered this discourse to those Athenian philosophers. But listen, this is going to be the first truth that he discloses about the unknown God that they acknowledged. Join me there, Acts chapter 17. We'll pick it up in verse 23. For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God, whom therefore you ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you. God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, he doesn't dwell in temples made with hands, and neither is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, seeing he gives to all life and breath and all things. He made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth. He hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might find after him. Listen to it. Though he be not far from every one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, even as certain of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Friends, even in that very brief introduction to the true God of heaven, how does Paul identify him? He's your creator. He's your creator. And he emphasizes, unlike the distorted notions that attend your other idolatrous gods, the true God, he knows man. He values man. He cares for man because he's his creation. In him we live, we move, we have our very being. It is from him that all of us have our life and breath and all things. You know, Angie, I thought it was interesting. They called him the unknown God. And Paul says, well, you might not know him, but he knows you. He knows you. Why? Because he's your creator. He knows you. Friends, our Creator knows us because of that relationship. In fact, he knows all of his creation intimately. Hebrews chapter 4:13 affirms, neither is there, listen to it, any creature that is not manifest in his sight. All things are naked and open unto the eyes of him with whom we have to do. But would we expect anything less? Because he is omniscient, he is omnipresent, he's our creator. And so all things are known to him. They are naked, they are open, they are manifest to his sight. He knows us intimately. In fact, Jesus, wanting to ensure his disciples of God's knowing them personally, you remember what he said about God? He told his disciples, God is aware of the number of hairs on your head, Ricky. Now, you know what? I have no idea why Jesus chose that piece of information as being something that God would know. And yet, as I think about it, Angie, maybe it's this. Maybe Jesus recognized, that's impossible for man to know. Have you ever thought about counting every hair on your head? Now, I know some folks are follically challenged, and so it might not take a lot of effort, but I'm thinking about my hair. And you know what? If I were, first of all, it'd be very difficult to count your own hair, right? But, you pick a strand, and then you think, I missed one. I missed a couple. And then you lose count. I'm thinking it's impossible for an individual to count and know the number of their hairs on their head. And if that's the reason, Jesus is trying to say, you can't know it, but God does. That's how intimately he knows you. And if that's not enough about myself, He knows the number of the hairs on the head of all 8 billion people on this earth. Friends, does that not profoundly and powerfully speak to God's knowing us intimately? Why? Because He's our Creator. And again, we would not expect anything less because of this relationship that He sustains to us. Since He created us, He would possess that kind of personal, thorough, perfect, intimate knowledge of us. Even the number of hairs on our head. I thought it was interesting. You remember where we started this series over in Psalm 139? Turn over there quickly. 139 Psalm, where David talked about the omnipresence, omniscience of God, and how that he said, it's too high for me. I cannot fully comprehend this. But notice what he goes on to say about that God. Psalm 139, let's pick it up in verse, there'd be a lot we could read here, but look at verse 12. Yea, the darkness hides not from thee, but the night shines as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to thee. Now, where would be a dark place? How about the mother's womb? For thou hast possessed my reins, you have covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise thee. I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows right well. Listen to it. My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect. And in your book all my members. Do you think that would include your hair? All my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned when as yet there was none of them. David says, my omniscient, my omnipresent God even saw me in the womb as my Creator. When He fashioned me, when He formed me, He knew everything about me before it was even in place. That would include, again, the number of my hairs. Friends, if that was true of David and his Creator, that's true of me. That's true of you. Why? Because God is our Creator, personally. And so this relationship speaks to God's perfect knowledge of each of us. But very quickly, this relationship also speaks to God's valuing us. Now, please understand, as Creator, God created everything that we see. John's prelude or prologue, that's what that says about Jesus. By Him were all things created, and without Him nothing was created that was made. Friends, God as Creator created everything that we could see. But among all that He created, we need to remember this. We, human beings, constitute God's crowning creation. Why would we characterize ourselves in that way? 2 reasons, I believe. Number one, first of all, because we are unique in that we were created in God's own image. That's not true of any other part of creation. We share God's image. That's one reason those traits and attributes are communicable. Because we can have that divine nature, part of God, as our creation or as our Creator. But then secondly, because of what He did to redeem us. He sent His Son to die for us. And friends, we again are unique in that. Not even the angels had a Redeemer. Jesus didn't come to the earth to die for angels. He came to the earth to die exclusively for us among God's creation. And that well speaks to God's not only knowing us, but God's valuing us. Now, I can certainly understand why the psalmist was inclined to look at this wondrous, vast universe that God created and then ask the question, why does God value man? You remember Psalm 8? Again, the writer is David, like Psalm 139. The same David who acknowledged that his God is omnipresent, omniscient. That same David looked on the universe and he knew God was its creator. And he said, when I consider the heavens, the work of your fingers, when I look at the moon and the stars and all that you have ordained, his question is, what's man? That you're mindful of man? What is the Son of Man that you visited him? Why would you value man so much over all of this as your creation? Again, David was acknowledging God's the creator of all of it, but he especially values you as human beings. God holds man in a special, highly valued place among all of his creation. In fact, in that context I was talking about numbering, God knowing the number of your hairs. Quickly look over there, Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10. Because I think it bears pointing out what it was that really God or Jesus was pointing out there. Now, Matthew chapter 10, interestingly, has to do with God sending, or Jesus is sending out the 12 apostles on the limited commission. And he's telling them, you are going to encounter hurt. You are going to suffer persecution. You are going to be hated for my sake. But notice what he says, don't fear them. Verse 28, don't fear them. Why? Verse 29, are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing? And one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father. Here it is, but the very hairs of your head are all numbered. What are we supposed to take from that, Jesus? What were his disciples to understand from that? In the midst of the possibility of hurt, because they're being hated, because they're being persecuted for this mission that Jesus sent them out, don't be afraid, because your Creator values you. In fact, he values you more than any other part of creation. Look at verse 31. Fear you not, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. See, that was his point. God not only knows you because he's your creator, he values you. And he values you more than any other part of his creation. I really find this interesting, Harold. When you go over to Luke chapter 12, here he says that 2 sparrows are sold for a farthing. Over there he says 5 sparrows can be bought for 2 farthings. You know what that means? You get one for free. All right? You get 4 for the price of, you get 5 for the price of 4. 2 farthings ought to buy you 4. But Jesus says, no, you can buy 5 for the price of 4. You know what that means? One of those, in man's estimation, is worthless. You get 5 for 4. But not to God. Oh, man might think it's of little value. But God, Jesus says, none of them is forgotten. Not even that one. Not one of them will fall to the ground without your Father's notice. He cares even for the sparrow, but he cares more for you. You are of more value than the sparrow. Harold, we actually have a song that was written from Jesus' teaching there. Have you ever heard his eye is on the sparrow? And if you've ever looked at those lyrics, when you analyze them, the songwriter brings together the omnipresence of God, our Creator, the immense value He has for us, and the comfort that we ought to derive from that. The very thing we're trying to develop in this point. Among the lyrics, whenever I am tempted, whenever clouds arise, my song gives place to sighing, my hope within me dies. But I draw the closer to Him. From His care He sets me free. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He cares for me. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He cares for me. I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. God, our Creator, values us so much, and the ultimate proof of that is, again, as soon as man violated his Creator's command in the Garden of Eden, as soon as man incurred the imposed sentence of death, even eternal separation from his Creator God in the garden, right there, man's Creator promised a remedy for his sin. And that remedy necessitated the death of the seed of woman, the very Son of God. You know, Ricky, we often value something by how much it costs us, right? The price that has to be paid. And if that's the case, think about how God values us because of the price that He paid. 1 Peter chapter 1, for as much as you know that you were not redeemed with corruptible things as silver and gold, from your vain conversation received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish, without spot, who verily was foreordained before the foundation of the world. That's how much God values us. He was willing to pay that price to redeem us. And knowing that, can we not easily reason, as did Paul, if God spared not His own Son, but delivered Him up for us all, how then shall He not with us freely give us all things? But very quickly, this relationship speaks to not only God's knowing us and valuing us, but also caring for us. I think that's an easy transition, isn't it? It's an easy, conclusion from that. If God values us so much, surely He cares for us. And it is true, our benevolent Creator constantly cares for us by providing us bountifully all the necessities that we need to sustain physical life. But friends, being unique to Him, being of more value than anything else by way of His creation, being His spiritual offspring, He freely, abundantly provides for us by caring for our greater needs, our spiritual needs. Yes, salvation, but 2 Peter 1 and verse 3, all things that pertain to life and godliness. Do you take great delight in hearing this about our Creator, our God? He says, cast all your care upon me because I care for you. I care for you. And once again, Ricky, we have a song that apparently came from that thought. Yes, for me He careth with loving, tender care. Yes, with me He shareth each burden and each fear. Yes, or me He watches, ceaseless watching night and day. Yes, even me He snatcheth from the perils of the way. Once again, the lyrics intersect God's omnipresence. He's always watching, with the assurance that He cares for us. And friends, that care certainly includes comfort, doesn't it? When He knows we're hurting, especially in light of who that God is as our Creator. I had some things I wanted to develop from 2 Corinthians chapter 1, because that's where Brother Apple was giving his lecture from yesterday. But listen to who our God is. Blessed be the God, even the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies, and the God of all comfort. Did you hear it? You know who our Creator is? He is the God of all comfort. He knows us intimately. He values us immeasurably. And He cares for us with all that we need. And He knows that we live in a hurting world. And He is the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all of our tribulation. Friends, there is nothing that we can face that brings us hurt that God doesn't know about and isn't able to provide what we need. How do we know that? He's the God of all comfort. That's comprehensive. Any comfort that we might require, God can supply that. But please understand, in that context, and I invite you again to hear Brother Apple's lecture, in that context, Paul's going to still be suffering affliction. You know what that means? God provides comfort even in the midst of the affliction. See, God's comforting us doesn't require that He take it away. He doesn't have to take the hurt away. He can comfort us in the midst of the suffering, even as we see illustrated in the case of Job, from which we've been studying. Friends, that word comfort means to lessen misery and grief by cheering and calming and inspiring with hope. That's how God comforts us. He doesn't have to take it away. He gives us what we need to sustain us, to help us, to comfort us in the very midst of our hurting. That's our God. And I hope we can take great assurance in that because of the first of these relationships that He has presented Himself by. He's our Creator, and that means He knows us, He values us, and He cares for us. And friends, knowing that about our God, and then on top of that, knowing He's always present and sees everything every time I'm hurting, that should give us great reason to find comfort in knowing about our God. Are you hurting? Friends, look to God. Look to your Creator. Because He knows you're hurting. And as being the God of all comfort, He knows how to provide a lessening of the misery. He can provide the peace and comfort, even in the midst of the hurt.